Well, I want to welcome everyone for coming out today and braving the weather. I wasn't sure how that was going to work out in the end, but I think maybe we missed the hurricane. Although one of our guests, you'll be glad to know, escaped a typhoon in Taiwan to get here. Apparently it's followed him, and he gets here and there's a hurricane, so that's really terrible luck. So, but if you have a hard time getting home this afternoon, you can blame him for the weather. We thought this would be a good topic to convene on because Taiwan's role in the South China Sea and how it should play in terms of finding ways to manage it, ultimately resolve some of the issues, bring down tensions around it, et cetera, I think is an issue that doesn't get enough attention in Washington, if any at all. Taiwan is one of the 6 claimants to the territory. We usually, many times, only hear of 5, and sometimes Taiwan's even left off the list in news reports and that sort of thing. The assumption being, well, it's part of China anyway, so why do we need to mention Taiwan? It's also resident in South China Sea, and the Spratlys, as you know, it once occupied the largest island in the Spratlys. Now, Taiwan didn't move, but the Chinese just built a bigger island. So now Fiery Cross Reef is actually bigger than Taiping Island or Ituaba, depending on what you want to call it. The Republic of China is also, as you know, the origin of the famous now 9-dash map that's at the center, really, of the current problem. That claim on behalf of the PRC, given the wherewithal the PRC has to back it up and the way that it has pursued its claims, is really at the heart of the problem right now. Were it just Taiwan's map, and it was Taiwan pursuing its interests there, I think we could work around that. But given the larger picture that China presents, part of the larger dynamic of power in Asia, it presents a much bigger problem. So all of that brings us to the topic of discussion, Taiwan's role in the South China Sea. We're glad to have several very, very expert opinions represented here on the stage. First, we're going to hear from Paul Giara. Paul is president of Global Strategies and Transformation, a highly regarded defense consultant in town. If he's interested, he could tell you some more detail about what exactly they're engaged in. Paul spent his career as a naval officer, or at least the first part of his career as a naval officer, retiring as a commander. He was an aviator, strategic planner, political military strategic planner for the Far East, South Asia, and Pacific issues, and he was manager of the U.S.-Japan Alliance in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Paul's a graduate of Harvard, the U.S. Naval War College, and Japan's National Institute for Defense Studies, which is based in Tokyo. So with that, let me let Paul talk to you for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll go each down the line and hopefully have some time at the end for discussion and Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Walter. I appreciate it. Nice to be here. And I figure that after changing a blown tire on the Dulles Toll Road this morning in this storm, talking about war and peace in the Taiwan Straits is going to be a piece of cake. The storm is indicative of what I think about this issue, because I think there's more than ever. There's a storm brewing. I think opinions and attitudes are changing about China. And I want to talk about and try to set the stage of what Walter has asked me to do, is set the stage for a more specific conversation about the South China Sea by talking more generally about the situation in the Western Pacific. And how do I start this?
It started. You just have to click through it.
Okay. Can you see that? Oh, okay. Oh,
Yeah.
the screen's over there. Okay. So, so let's get started. I'm going to show you some maps. And the reason I'm going to show you maps is because I think that we are already at war with China. And you don't have to take my word for it. Just ask the Chinese. They're practicing warfare, known as the 3 warfares, but they're also maneuvering and building up their military forces with, I think, increasingly clear intent in mind. And at a time like this, I think it's particularly important to look at a map. But what's interesting about where we are now in our relationship with Taiwan and Taiwan's relationship with everyone else is that the Chinese, mainland Chinese, have convinced us to not look at maps. So we're not thinking of Taiwan in the context of geography or military operations. We're thinking of Taiwan as a political problem that we all want to make go away. And the Chinese have convinced us that in order to maintain peace and stability in the Taiwan Straits, all we have to do is keep Taiwan quiet and not a problem for us. The trouble, of course, is that the situation in the Taiwan Straits is neither peaceful nor stable, but I guess that's sort of just, oh, no, never mind. But at a time like this, it's important to look at maps because the maps have both political and military significance. So first I'm going to show you a map that I grew up with coming up in the U.S.-Japan alliance track. This map that I'll show you is created by Dr. Jim Auer, who is the Dean of U.S.-Japan Alliance Management, and it depicts the geostrategic reality for the Soviet Union of the Cold War in Asia. And what Jim did was he turned the map sort of basically on its head. And this is a Soviet view of Japan during the Cold War. And you can see that from this perspective, Japan is the cork in the Soviet bottle in the Western Pacific. And the Soviets couldn't come out without going through Japan. So now I'm going to show you an updated view of Jim's Cold War map. It's taken more recently from Google Earth. It's easy to do. You can do it too. If I can do it, believe me, you can do it. And it shows Japan from a slightly different Chinese perspective. And the point is the same, to illustrate the compelling geostrategic reality in the Sino-Japanese relationship. And here, Japan, in some ways, although only partially because of the maritime geography, plays the same role for the PRC. And this is playing out in the rhetoric and the operations and the buildup over the Senkakus and in the South China Sea and in the increasing naval rivalry and air rivalry between China and Japan, and also between China and the United States. The third version of what amounts to the same geostrategic view shifts the perspective somewhat to include the full perspective of the PRC's broad ocean approaches. So China has a slightly different coastline. It's longer, and this view is oriented strategically to align with current realities. And now you see that it's not just Japan, but it's Japan and Taiwan and the Philippines and Vietnam and Indonesia that frame this geography offshore for the Chinese. So the next view I'm going to show you, the fourth view, puts Taiwan in its most appropriate military operational perspective as a key geostrategic bastion. Now remember, this is what the Chinese, the mainland Chinese, don't want us to think about. They don't want to see Taiwan as a problem for them. They want to be able to sort of minimize that in our minds. And they don't want us to think of Taiwan as anything but a distraction and a problem for us. But in fact, in geostrategic terms and in military operational terms, Taiwan is a great advantage. By virtue of its location, Taiwan challenges the PRC's control of its broad ocean approaches. This compelling geostrategic reality has been completely lost in the propaganda and the psychological warfare and the politics of what's going on between China and the rest of us. So here's that. And you see that Taiwan is right in the middle of this line that China must contend with. Must contend with. Now, think about this and think about what this means. Either Taiwan is going to be on our side and an advantage for us, or in a blink of an eye, political change, and Taiwan is an advantage for China. Which is it to be? So this view also has another natural virtue, because it clearly illustrates Taiwan's natural long-term allies and partners. This additional geostrategic reality is the basis for military planning and geopolitical action. What does it come from? It comes from looking at the map and not necessarily thinking about what's possible, although that is one of the outcomes I'm interested in, and I think you should think about that. But what is true? What is so? What is real now? Now, in the context of, and again, you may disagree, just ask the Chinese, though, whether or not you think we are already in conflict with China puts increasing impetus behind thinking about this. So now I want to show you a diagram that I've put together that tries to capture the specific importance of Taiwan with regard to not just this bastion, but a military salient. Now, in military terms, if you don't know, a salient is like a wedge. And it has advantages and it has disadvantages. The advantages, it's a deep penetration into your enemy's lines. And that puts him in great risk because it's the point of departure for breakthroughs and exploitation. On the other hand, of course, it has to be defended because the enemy can come at it from a number of different directions. But this maritime salient that we're talking about is, in fact, you'll see it displayed as China's attempt to cause and create a salient into the maritime battle space. This is the future battle space if Beijing continues to militarize its emergence. Because China, the essence of China's military change is that China is coming to sea. This is why the South China Sea is important in all of this. China is making no bones about it. There should be no misunderstanding that China wants to control these seaward approaches to China. And this fact and this salient should be the beginning for creative, strategic, and operational planning for us. Because this is what China is trying to do. So China is the blue arrow coming out into the maritime salient, which is the pink reddish triangle, opposed by the rest of us, who are the yellow arrows coming at it. It's very straightforward. Now, is warfare this clean and neat and organized? No, of course not, but it conceptually captures what's really happening. But you can only get a sense of this if you look at a map. If you sort of sit there in your study or your office or on the metro and look at something like this and think about it. Clear your mind and think about it. Because this is what the Chinese are doing. They're thinking about it. So here's another view of Taiwan's military geography. It shows the operational centrality of Taiwan in the whole region. Look at it. It's right there in the middle. This is tremendously important. Not just militarily, by the way, but politically as well. And so here's a view of Taiwan's political geography. Again, it shows the centrality of Taiwan. You will recognize that this is stretched a little only because I had to make it fit this way. But you see Taiwan there in the middle, surrounded by the variety of colors that indicate the potential political alignments that are, in my view, increasingly going to be on offer for Taiwan and for those of us interested in stability, and real peace in the Western Pacific. Now, finally, here's a view of Taiwan's geography with regard to the South China Sea. I don't mean to say by any means that the South, after what I've just said, that the South China Sea is a sideshow. No, it's central to all of this. It's the throat of the global economy. But the South China Sea cannot be controlled or dominated without control and dominance of the surrounding land masses. So when we think about this as a military theater, sometimes we think, well, it's just ships. And oh, by the way, they come from Hawaii or someplace, or Yokosuka, and what difference does the local geography have to do with that? Well, the fact of the matter is that the way things work in this theater, you have to control the land. So first, that helps you to think about the military campaigns that might occur. And second, it puts those countries in perspective. And third, it reminds that without that land, naval and air forces cannot operate. Cannot operate. And if they don't have control of that land, the first order of business is to take it or take it back. Hence long-range amphibious operations and so on that we've seen before in this region. So this map illustrates, that I'm going to show you, illustrates Taiwan's key position on the northern flank of any maritime operation in the South China Sea. Is it any wonder that China doesn't want us to look at these maps? So here you see Taiwan in the upper right corner, and this is, of course, in front of us is the South China Sea. Taiwan is as important in this regard as are the Philippines and Malaysia and Indonesia and Vietnam. Because if one of these flanks is dominated, then the holder of that territory can turn the other flanks. So I think this gives us something to think about. And this is a time when I suggest that we have to go through the most difficult of intellectual processes, which is to change our minds. Now, this is not unprecedented, but typically it only comes at moments of extreme pain and discomfort and danger. And I say, no, we should be doing this now. We should be thinking creatively, thoughtfully, realistically about where Taiwan fits into all of this. But before we can get to that point, we have to suspend disbelief. We have to think about the potential, the likelihood, and the fact of conflict with China. The Chinese are thinking that way, quite clearly, and they've been thinking this way since just about the end of the Cold War. Plans long laid and in place for in process for a long time are now coming to reality, and we're seeing the buildup of Chinese naval and air forces and missile forces toward this end. So the hard part of this, though, is that the Chinese have convinced us that it's their future, not Taiwan's. And more to the point, they're trying to convince us that it's their future, not our future, that is America's future. And that if we only go along, we'll all get rich, won't we? We'll all get rich. And if we only go along, it will just be peaceful. Okay? So it's kind of like Dr. Krikorian putting somebody to death. It'll be just fine. Just fine. Okay? So with that, look at a map. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Well, that was a crystal clear way to begin this presentation, begin this program. So that's exactly what we're trying to do. Look at it in all its clarity and reality and realism. So that was a good way to start. I want to turn it over now to Dr. Lynn Kwok. Lynn is a non-resident fellow at the Center for East Asia Policy Studies at Brookings Institution, and she was recently a senior fellow at the Center for International Law in Singapore. She holds a PhD from Cambridge, Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School, and an LLB from National University of Singapore. So she comes at this with a great deal of learning and expertise. She's going to talk to us a little bit about the broad overview of Taiwan's position, the way it's evolved over time. I think you've written some very recently on similar, so we look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you, Walter. Thank you, Walter, and I'd like to thank you and the Heritage Foundation for the invitation to speak on this panel today. We've just heard Mr. Paul Guerra speak to us about why Taiwan matters geostrategically. I'd like to talk a little bit more about why Taiwan matters in the South China Sea and how potentially the words and actions that Taiwan bring to bear on this issue can actually have a stabilizing influence in the South China Sea. So first, as Walter just mentioned, I'll examine Taiwan's position in the South China Sea and how this is evolving. I will then consider why this matters and could help foster greater stability. And I'll turn at the end of my talk to briefly touch on how some of the other actors have responded to Taiwan's overtures. In doing so, I'll also be looking at some of the constraints that Taiwan sees itself as facing in carving out a position independent from China's. So first, Taiwan's position. The extent of Taiwan's territorial claims in the South China Sea are clear. It claims the 4 groups of islands in the South China Sea. Taiwan's maritime claims, however, are more ambiguous. This ambiguity, as you all know, stems from the dash line, or the U-shaped line, which does not have geographic coordinates, but it appears to encapsulate much of the South China Sea. Neither China nor Taiwan have officially clarified the dash line's meaning. As such, this dash line can be interpreted as either encapsulating all the waters within the South China, all the waters within the dash line, or merely the land features, as well as UNCLOS-compliant maritime zones surrounding these land features. So, as you know, UNCLOS generates a 12 nautical mile from islands, as well as 200 nautical mile EEZ, 12 nautical miles from rocks, and 200 nautical mile EEZ from islands, which are rocks that are capable of sustaining human habitation and economic life. The Convention also makes very clear that these maritime zones should be drawn from land features. In the past, we saw that Taiwan's statements in this respect were inconsistent. However, I think within the last year, it's become increasingly clear that Taiwan is making claims that are from land and that are in accordance with UNCLOS and international law. I think the clearest signal in this respect came over the summer when the Ministry of Foreign Affairs revised its official statements on the South China Sea to include specific reference to UNCLOS. Thus, if we look at the April 29th and July 7th statements, they call on countries to respect the principles and spirit of all international law, including the UN Charter of the United Nations and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. A second development that signals that Taiwan's claims are intended to be UNCLOS compliant is its provision in its July statement that provision of evidence in its July statement that Taiping or Ituaba is an island capable of generating an EEZ in continental shelf. So it provided evidence that Taiping Island is capable of sustaining human habitation or economic life. And I urge you all to have a look at the July 7th statement, in which it provided both pictures as well as a very well-produced video on Taiping Island. I think one thing to note about that video as well is how it sets out the dash line. So when it actually talks about the South China Sea and its claims there, it highlights the land features that it lays claim to, and then it talks about surrounding waters, but we don't see a picture of the dash line. Where we do see a picture of the dash line is later on in the video when it talks about historical happenings and everything, and then we see a quick flash of the map that contains the dash line. So I think that is quite significant. I found that rather interesting. A third way in which we can infer that Taiwan is actually adopting an approach in the South China Sea that is compliant with international law is its attempts to move towards a more conciliatory approach there. So at the end of May 2015, President Ma officially launched a South China Sea peace initiative, urging parties to shelve disputes and promote joint exploration and development. Dr. Wang will be speaking about this more, so I will not touch on this further. Oh, sorry, one thing I wanted to say as well on Taiping Island is that the provision of evidence on Taiping Island being an island under UNCLOS is important because it shows that Taiwan intends to comply with the UNCLOS rulebook. So all this, both its revised statements, its provision of evidence that Taiping Island is an island under UNCLOS, as well as its South China Sea Peace Initiative, all these taken together, I think, we can read from that Taiwan intends its claims to be in accordance with international law. So I've covered the recent evolution in Taiwan's position and approach in the South China Sea. Why do these developments matter? They matter because they have the effect of distancing the ROC from any expansive PRC claims. In other words, Taiwan, by its words and actions, are serving to introduce possible daylight between the ROC and the PRC's positions. I think this could help to stabilize the region. As Walter pointed out at the start, the PRC inherited the ROC's claims after the Chinese Civil War. Thus, how Taiwan interprets these claims are significant for how China should be interpreting its claims. Moreover, I think it's important to note that a more limited reading of these claims would not be inconsistent with China's official position. In its note verbal to the United Nations of 2009 and 2011, China asserted sovereignty over the waters adjacent to the islands. It also claimed sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the relevant waters, as well as the seabed and subsoil thereof. So if reference to adjacent waters means the territorial sea, and relevant waters means the EEZ, then China's claims can in fact be read as consistent with UNCLOS. Now, for various geostrategic reasons we've heard Mr. Paul Garrett highlight, China is unlikely to explicitly abandon the dash line. However, Beijing might be prompted to at least refrain from rhetoric and actions that implies that it enjoys historic rights to and jurisdiction over the resources anywhere within it. So in other words, China might be prompted because of Taiwan's actions and words to cease activities which might be more problematic or illegitimate under the law. So I'm not saying that this will solve everything. However, I think there needs to be various pressure points on China, and I think this is one way that there can be one pressure point to ensure that behavior is legitimate under the law. So I've highlighted Taiwan's evolving position. I've also explained why I think it matters. What have some of the responses to Taiwan's actions been? First, let me deal with some of the unofficial responses. I've spoken to some analysts who say that Taiwan hasn't gone far enough. This argument takes two lines. The first, more extreme line, or the more unforgiving line, is that Taiwan should just come right out and abandon the dash line. The second, more nuanced or subtle approach says that Taiwan does not need to abandon the line. However, it should come out and say what this dash line means. In other words, it should say that the dash line merely claims the land features as well as UNCLOS compliant zones. On Taiwan's part, however, it sees itself as walking a tightrope between the desire to be a constructive player in the South China Sea, on the one hand, and domestic considerations and fears of repercussions from China on the other. So these are very real concerns, and I think Taiwan on its part sees some very conservative elements within its society that says that everything within the dash line belongs to it. I think it's worried about ruffling these feathers. It's also worried about destabilizing the situation with China by explicitly undermining the legitimacy of the dash line as a claim to all the waters within it. So I think for these reasons, because of Taiwan's political constraints, it is important to read between the lines of their claims. So when President Ma confirms that the land dominates the sea, and official statements are revised to urge parties to comply with UNCLOS, Taiwan is doing all but saying that the dash line cannot be interpreted as a claim to the wide expanse of water within it. And perhaps it is for this reason that an influential member of the Supreme Court of the Philippines recently came out to praise President Ma's interpretation of the dash line. So he'll be speaking next week in DC, where I think he'll be talking about how a possible resolution of the dispute could come where China would return to the original intent of the dash line as articulated by President Ma. So I think at least from the Philippines perspective, or the Philippines legal community's perspective, these evolutions in Taiwan's statements have been very positive. In terms of official responses to Taiwan's recent overtures, there's unfortunately been very little to go by. The US State Department, to its credit, has expressed public support of the peace plan. China, when asked about it, responded rather more coolly. It said that it noted the initiative, but then reasserted the obligation of Chinese people on both sides of the straits to jointly safeguard national territorial sovereignty and maritime rights and interests. I think this was a missed opportunity for China to demonstrate its sincerity on a peaceful resolution of the South China Sea dispute. ASEAN and its member states, who I would have thought have the greatest interest in coming out in support of Taiwan, have remained silent. When asked about the peace plan, the Singapore foreign minister said that claimants actually have, the views of claimants would be more relevant and should matter more. This might perhaps be true, however, I think both non-claimants and claimant states in the South China Sea all have an interest in peace and stability, and any action that could lead to greater peace and stability should be supported. So we should not only be seeking to discourage or punish bad actions, we should also be seeking to encourage positive actions. I think at the root of ASEAN and its member states' reluctance to engage with Taiwan on this issue has been China's One China principle. However, I think there's a great degree, well, I think great degree would be too strong. I think ASEAN and its member states have been rather conservative in terms of interpreting what would fall foul of the One China principle. So they are afraid to touch Taiwan or any issue relating to Taiwan with a 10-foot pole. And I think there needs to be a more nuanced approach to the One China principle. The failure to engage Taiwan has and will hurt proper management of the dispute. Taiwan, as we heard, controls the largest natural land feature. Its Coast Guard regularly patrol the seas. It also has a huge fishing industry, one of the largest in the Asia Pacific. So any agreement in this respect will have to include Taiwan. Crucially, what Taiwan claims, and by implication does not claim, can help stabilize the dispute. So ASEAN and its member states might want to consider ways in which to involve Taiwan without falling foul of the One China principle. And here I'd like to suggest some possibilities. We can engage in Track 2 activities. There could be cooperative activities on maritime environmental protection, marine scientific research, search and rescue, etc., that are negotiated and agreed to between the agencies directly involved, rather than through formal treaties. We've seen this happen in the East China Sea, where the relevant agencies within Taiwan, as well as the relevant agency within Japan, have signed a fisheries agreement. Perhaps more controversially as well, Taiwan can be invited to participate in the Code of Conduct negotiations as an observer or guest. Now, in an early May 2015 report, I made several recommendations for Taiwan. Amongst them, I called for Taiwan to clarify its position in the South China Sea without expressly abandoning the dash line, as I saw this as destabilizing, potentially destabilizing. I also urged Taiwan to promote a peace initiative in the South China Sea. In addition, I asked if Taiwan could consider providing evidence that Taiping Island is an island under UNCLOS and show that it is following the UNCLOS rulebook. Within just the space of a few months, Taipei has undertaken steps in line with all of these recommendations. This, to me, is a tremendously positive development and shows considerable political will on the part of Taiwan to be a constructive player in the South China Sea. And all this is notwithstanding the constraints it's facing. Actors with an interest in peace and stability in the region, including China, should be supportive of Taiwan's efforts. All this takes on added urgency, with tensions rising in the South China Sea, as well as the upcoming elections in Taiwan, where, with uncertain consequences for Taiwan's South China Sea policy, as well as its broader relations with China. Thank you.
That was excellent. Actually, relatively hopeful, I think, and that's good. I think you're wise to point out the two different interpretations of the 9-dash map from Beijing's perspective, because I think most of us focus on the most dangerous of those interpretations, but they have made an effort to keep the more benign interpretation open. Mm-hmm. And so maybe some of these moves on Taiwan's part that stop short of coming out and directly challenging their interpretation, but tinkering around the edges, could nudge them in the direction of eventually taking the more constructive interpretation of the map. So it gave me hope. So and that's not easy to do on this issue. So I very much appreciate that. Next, I want to turn the microphone over to Dr. Dustin Kwong-Seung Wong. Dr. Wong is professor at the Graduate Institute of Political Science, National Taiwan Normal University, and he's also an adjunct professor of international law at Chinese Culture University. Dustin is the guy who escaped the typhoon to be here in time for the hurricane that I mentioned earlier. Dr. Wong is a specialist in international law of the sea. From the year 2000 to 2008, he served as the Deputy Secretary General of the Chinese Society of International Law and is currently on its board of directors. He's also Secretary General of the Institute of Marine Affairs and Policy. He's got many other responsibilities and positions related to those issues aside. I won't go through all of them, but just believe me, he's an expert on this set of issues. Dustin obtained his PhD in international law from the University of Bristol in the UK in 1997. So with that, let me turn it over to Dr. Wong, and he will take us the next step.
Thank you, Roman, for your introduction. Basically, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to participate in this meeting under the title of Taiwan in the South China Sea. And I also would like to express my sincere thanks to Director Walter Lohman for your invitation. Although the way I start from Taiwan, and probably I'm leaving here tomorrow, I would came across with the typhoon and the hurricane. However, I think it is worthy to have this opportunity to discuss the issues here. And basically, before I start my presentation, I would like to make two disclaimers. The first one is the name of my university I affiliated with. Normal University. Normal means teacher training and education. So basically, it does not mean other universities in Taiwan are abnormal. And secondly, being a normal professor at the Normal University, so the presentation I'm going to make is purely from my personal perspective, and also about the result of my study. So this is the outline of the presentation that I'm going to make. 3 points. The first point is to have look at the South China Sea Peace Initiative. I think that has already been mentioned by the previous panelists. And the second point that I would like to have a visit on the Taiping Island, because I got the opportunity to visit Taiping Island twice. So I took some pictures, and I include them onto the satellite image, so that I want to make the audience here to have a better idea about what's really that we are going to have on the Taiping Island. And the third one is the what kind of role that Taiwan could play. I think probably this is the main thing that we are going to discuss today. First is the South China Sea Peace Initiative mentioned and actually raised by the President Ma Ying-jeou in May this year. There are only 5 points, so I don't want to go through every one, but I just have a very brief introduction about the contents of the peace initiative. The first one is actually that we want a peace and a stability situation in the South China Sea. And the second one, that will be talking about settling the dispute peacefully. In other words, we support the peaceful settlement of the disputes. And the third one, I think that the previous two panelists, they had already mentioned that the importance of the Taiwan. Therefore, we strongly argue that all parties has to be included in the or participate in the discussion, cooperation, or dialogue. And obviously, Taiwan should not be ignored. And the fourth one, I think that is the most interesting one, and probably that's the one that we should pay attention to. Basically, the idea for the point 4, that is about how to start the joint development. But I think we should pay more attention on the later wording, which is regional cooperation and under the integrated planning. That is the idea that wider than the normal or ordinary joint development. Because when we're talking about joint development or joint cooperation, that would mean to explore or exploit the hydrocarbon resources or the living resources such like fish. However, as we can understand that for those resources, especially for the living resources, they move around without taking care of the land boundary that made by man. Therefore, we have to got this idea that we got to have a kind of integrated planning so that the joint development or joint cooperation could be fulfilled. And the last one, that is also about the non-traditional security issues that Taiwan would like to pay attention to and would like to contribute to. So after mentioned about the South China Sea Peace Initiative, I would like to lead you to take a look at what we are having at the Taiping Island, or that will be also called Ituaba in the westernized wording. First of all, that we can see the area for the Taiping Island, that is 0.49. That is the area for that island, and it is more than 1,200 meters long and about 365 meters in its width. And most importantly, that there are more than 120 persons. They could sustain their human habitation on that island. Next one shows that on that island we have an airstrip which is about 1,200 meters long, and it was built in the year 2008 on the two sides of that airstrip that could keep the, for example, on the east side of the airstrip, that it could keep two C-130 transport aircraft, and on the west side also can keep one. Therefore, we can understand the just a little bit about the size about that island. And then we have the solar cell panel. According to our statistics, after we finish the solar cell panels, we had already saved about 20% of the diesel consumption, which would make the Taiping Island to become a model for the green energy. And that is the wharf, that we have two wharfs. However, they are not strong enough. Basically, especially when we want to transport the personnel or the goods to the island or receive them from the island, that is very dangerous. Therefore, we are doing certain reconstruction projects, and then I will show you the picture later. And we have the command headquarters and also the warship temple on that island. And this is interesting because this picture shows about the water. We have more than 5 water wells on the Taiping Island. And I do believe that water probably will be one of the most important elements to be, when we think about the Article 121 UNCLOS. I think that article just been mentioned by Dr. Lin Cook. That is, should be sustainable for the human habitation or its economic life. And from this picture that we can see the water well number 5 that can produce the fresh water every day. And quite surprisingly to me, I got the, before I left Taiwan, I got the information from the research lab in the National Taiwan University. The result for the water quality, I mean the salinity, even the water quality from the water well number 5, it is much better than the water that we could have in Macau. So that is quite interesting and surprisingly, isn't it? And also we have the Happy Farm, that we could have the vegetables for the personnel over there. And this is the hospital. We have the most advanced medical facilities in the region, in the Taiping Island. And for example, we also have this kind of medical treatment for the fishermen in that area. And this chart shows the number of foreign fishermen receive medical treatment from our hospital. Basically, it is not much. However, we are trying our best to do this kind of non-traditional security matters, especially for those assistance during the dangerous period, or in the period that they need those assistance. So this is the picture that shows that that we are undertaking the reconstruction projects. We want to reinforce the left-hand side. On the left-hand side, we want to reinforce the wharf so that it will be safer for the transportation. And as well, not only for the personnel, but also for the goods. So I I'm going to wrap up and come to the conclusion. And the conclusion, I would also like to make it as the third point that I'm going to present. I would like to say that cooperation on non-traditional security issues, that is essential and important. And Taiwan could play a constructive role in the functional cooperation because Taiwan has the capacity, and the political will that we can understand from the peace initiative as well as what we are doing on the Taiping Island. And so what could be done? I believe that we could do the following items: search and rescue, the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and the fishery resources management, and also the environmental protection and the research on resources. So my point is, if we could put those items together, we can make it as a safer environment, just like the capitalize those items. So I believe that Taiwan could do more, and Taiwan could make the situation in the South China Sea more safer. So that is my presentation today, and all comments and discussions are welcome. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Wong. That was also very constructive and hopeful. And I should point out too, I think that the prerequisite for the region, especially ASEAN and your neighbors, taking some of these ideas seriously and including Taiwan, is sort of a continued responsible approach to the issues. And I have to say, I know this is contested issues in Taiwan, but Meng Zhou's constructive approach to the PRC actually helps facilitate these things, because the ASEAN countries are like cats, okay? If you move too quickly, you scare them away. So you have to just kind of ease up on them and let them in slowly, and understanding if Taiwan becomes too aggressive in its relationship with China, you'll scare them away, and it will dissipate any of this potential for cooperation. But there's a lot of good, hopeful things in there. So ending your presentation on a note of hope is a perfect segue to Dean Chung, who will promptly dash all hope, I think. If he lives up to his reputation, and with that look of glee on his face, I think he plans to. Oh, yeah. Dean is Senior Research Fellow here at the Asian Studies Center. He is our resident China and Taiwan expert on political security issues. He's been here for 5 years now, I think, a little over 5 years. Before that, he was with CNA for 13 years. He was at CNA and SAIC for 13 years as a total, as an analyst there. He does some outstanding work, and as someone who's also very personally interested in many of these issues beyond just my job, just my natural curiosity, I'm so lucky to have him right down the hall where I can pepper him with questions that really have nothing to do with his day-to-day tasks, but something that I can learn. He's someone that I can always learn from. So let me turn it over to Dean to round this out, and then we hope to get to some Q&A.
Well, good morning. Thank you all for being here on a rainy Friday. I was asked to basically talk a little bit about how Taiwan and the South China Sea impacts the United States, and conversely, what is the American perspective on all of this. So thinking about this, my thoughts immediately turn to the USS Constitution. The USS Constitution is the oldest ship in the United States Navy, and it is, in fact, the only warship in the United States Navy that has sunk a ship. No other ship in the U.S. Navy currently has that distinction and honor. Interestingly, the Constitution sank its last opponent, I believe, during the War of 1812, which was fought in part over freedom of the seas. The point about the USS Constitution reflects several things. One, that the U.S. has often been called upon to enforce freedom of navigation, freedom of the seas, including through the use of force. And second, the fundamental reality that the United States Navy has long dominated the ocean. Since the end of the Cold War, there hasn't been U.S. Navy involvement in high-intensity conflict at sea. And in fact, the last sustained American combat operations at sea were escorting tankers through the Gulf 27 years ago. This reflects a larger global reality, which is that the world's seas have been, for the most part, peaceful. Now, they're not peaceful if you're a merchant ship passing near the Gulf of Aden necessarily. But in terms of high-intensity naval combat, the last major naval war was in the Falklands in 1982. Now, this should be very sobering for a number of reasons. First, it does speak well of the state of the world's oceans, which are, as Mahan put it, highways for transportation of goods, also for services, in terms of also as a means of keeping nations secure. But the fact that it has been almost 33 years since the last war at sea should be sobering because of how limited, therefore, we really have a sense of what future naval warfare could be like. And here let me bring up the idea of Moore's Law. Moore's Law basically says, in hypersimplified form, that roughly every 24 months the number of processors on a given size chip doubles. So between 1982 and the present, there have been 16 cycles of Moore's Law. I was born here in the US, so therefore my math isn't very good. But basically that means that today's computers are 65,000 times more powerful than they were at the time of the Falklands conflict. Now, the Falklands conflict caught a lot of us by surprise at how vulnerable the Type 42s were in particular. Some of you may even remember pictures of British warships sinking in the face of Exocets. Those aircraft, those ships, those missiles are today quite obsolete. To put this in a different context, many of you here probably have iPhones. Your iPhone contains $3,000 worth of gadgets from 1990. Contains even more gadgets if you go back to 1982, including such interesting items as an AM/FM radio. Anybody actually still remember what those are? A video camera, a CD player, and there's more computing power in your iPhone than in the $1,600 TRS-80 equivalent that you would have been able to get at Radio Shack. In fact, it arguably has more computing power than might have been available to the Apollo space program. Now, Paul kindly put up a bunch of maps, and I'm going to invoke those, so if you'll just, turn your Wayback Machine a little further forward to just what he was talking about. Consider also the following, why all of this matters is the first island chain, of which Taiwan is part, is both a barrier and a shield. It is a barrier to China if it is in the hands of adversaries. China's Navy cannot go out to sea very easily if it has to transit through a variety of choke points, much as the Soviet Navy would have had to transit the 3 key straits to exit the Sea of Japan back during the Cold War. It is, however, a shield for China if much or most or key parts of it are in Chinese hands. And this is of especially great importance, one might almost be tempted to say salient importance, if you consider that China's economic center of gravity is today on the coast. In the 1960s, China devoted much of its industrial development to what was called the Third Line, which was deep inland China, Sichuan, Yunnan province. And the whole idea was to be able to survive the inevitable coming early war, major war, nuclear war that was inevitably going to be fought with the Soviet Union and possibly the United States at the same time. So building your industrial economic facilities deep inland in mountain valleys in incredibly non-economic ways was how China was going to sustain itself. Deng Xiaoping was much more pragmatic. He ended all of that. He moved many of those factories to the coast. The good news for China is that has been the centerpiece, the powerhouse, the ability for China to economically develop, in part because of its ability to easily access those same world waterways. The bad news, if you are the PLA, is you no longer have thousands of square miles of land from which to base air defense of that same economic center of gravity. And now that it is on the coast, it is absolutely essential, if you're going to protect that economic center of gravity, to be able to dominate the waters stretching out. Because it's not a matter of the range of smoothbore naval cannon, it's not even the range of 16-inch rifled barrels on battleships. It is Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles, which have a range of thousands of miles. And it is therefore in this context that China is looking at that South China Sea. It is a pathway out, but it is also a vulnerability, a pathway in. And the South China Sea in particular, because it fronts onto Hainan Island. For those of you who, like me, are old enough to remember, Hainan is Chinese for Kola Peninsula. The Kola Peninsula was that portion of the Soviet Union that was perhaps some of the most militarized real estate on Earth. Consider what is being built or already exists on Hainan. We have a spaceport, China's newest, from which they will be able to launch their largest, newest space launch vehicles, the Long March 5. You have a ballistic missile submarine facility, part of your strategic nuclear deterrent. You have facilities to support nuclear and conventionally powered attack submarines. You have multiple air bases, and in fact the EP-3 incident back in 2001 saw the damaged American aircraft land at a military air base on Hainan. So Hainan by itself is already a vital strategic target. And then of course you have continental China as well, all of which from the South China Sea is exceedingly vulnerable. Why does this matter for the United States? We therefore need to recognize that what we do regarding the South China Sea will affect how China perceives us, and conversely, what China is doing there should affect how we perceive them. When we do not transit within 12 nautical miles of artificial islands that do not exert any of the spheres of influence, if you will, whether it is territorial waters or EEZs, and we do not do so for 3 years, despite the statements of the Secretary of Defense at Shangri-La and elsewhere, that we will go where we need to and enforce freedom of navigation, that is going to be interpreted, not just in Beijing, but also in Moscow, and in Damascus, and in Tehran. If China believes it can intimidate, whether it is the neighbors or the United States on the South China Sea, that also has implications for Taiwan. And conversely, if the United States is seen as failing to live up to the Taiwan Relations Act with regards to providing Taiwan with the wherewithal for its defense, that too will be read by Beijing. We also need to recognize that China, even more than Russia, is the master of political warfare. China is not necessarily looking for a fight in the South China Sea, but would certainly be happy to be able to secure what it has now repeatedly and bluntly stated is Chinese territory. And here I would refer you most recently to the first Sea Lord/RUSI International Sea Power Conference a fortnight ago in London. Chinese Vice Admiral Yuan Yubai, commander of the People's Liberation Army Navy's North Sea Fleet, basically stated, and I quote, "The South China Sea, as the name indicates, is a sea area that belongs to China." One should be very careful about this. There are multiple Chinatowns in the United States. Who knows where they will belong next? The sea from the Han Dynasty a long time ago, where the Chinese people have been working and producing from the sea. This does not, to my mind, bespeak a very cooperative approach. Or as someone asked this year at the Shangri-La dialogue, while China often talks of a win-win approach, who else has won? This statement by a Chinese naval officer is a reminder that while the political warfare effort has mostly involved Chinese law enforcement vessels, what is sometimes termed white hulls, there are Chinese gray hulls operating nearby as well. And recently, the Philippine mayor of Pagasa Island has himself photographed Chinese naval warships or gray hulls in the waters near his island. As China's military strengthens, the implicit threat posed by the Chinese Navy, its ability to coerce, will strengthen. And here it is important to also recognize the linguistic aspect. The Chinese term is wei si. Wei si is translated as deterrence. The problem is that for us as Americans, we focus on the dissuasion aspect of deterrence. whether you read Bernard Brody, or Jack Snyder, or various other American scholars on deterrence, they all openly say deterrence only means dissuasion. There is no coercive aspect. The problem is that from the Chinese perspective, 威慑 means both dissuasion and coercion. And in this regard, deterrence in turn is tied to warfighting, because the best form of deterrence, whether for dissuasive or coercive purposes, is the ability to fight and win. And the PLA is indeed focused on fighting and winning local wars under informationized conditions. So when we look at the modern Chinese approach to maritime power, and let me emphasize here, maritime power, not just naval power, it is important to see not just combat platforms and missiles from ships, but increasingly the ability to challenge for control of the seas via attacks on information platforms, whether it is space systems or cyber capabilities. So if conflict should break out for the South China Sea, and here again I use the term conflict, not war, it may well not be fleet on fleet or even shows of force by navies, but instead will be political warfare, including legal warfare, psychological warfare, and above all public opinion warfare, shaping the views not only of the United States, but of nations in the region, their populations as well as their leadership, and as important, reinforcing the argument to the Chinese people that this is a defense of Chinese territory, which induces a very different view of the problem than if they were thinking that this was taking someone else's land. As important, it involves struggles between rival arrays of electronics, information dominance, and the ability to secure it may well alleviate the need for combat as it helps establish maritime and air dominance in and of itself. And the ability to dominate the South China Sea, whether by force or by implied threat of force, has distinct implications for the United States, for Taiwan, for Japan and South Korea, through whom their economic and energy lifelines run. Let me close then by suggesting that the United States must act, and it must act now, even if it is the last quarter of the administration, because whether it is the last quarter or not for us, it is not the last quarter for Xi Jinping, who will stay in power through 2022, barring tectonic levels of change in China. Some of the ideas that I would suggest are out there. One of them should be the role of the U.S. White Hull Fleet. That just as China employs its maritime law enforcement, so should the United States. And yes, I understand that the Coast Guard doesn't have that many cutters, but that is not an argument for saying that it should not get more funding, or it should not therefore play a greater role. Freedom of navigation, as I noted, has long been an American belief and something that we've been willing to fight for. It is even more something that we should be willing to express our support for. And running away from 12 nautical mile limits around areas that exert no such legal claim is the best way of giving up on freedom of the seas and freedom of navigation. And finally, there is the diplomatic aspect. We should be pressing China, especially since we have apparently decided to invite them to RIMPAC 2016, to at least grant reciprocity and American access to Chinese multilateral exercises, such as they have recently conducted in the Eastern Med with the Russians and are conducting through the SCO. But that also begs the question why it is that we are more willing to show capabilities, such as anti-air and anti-submarine warfare capabilities as our practice at RIMPAC, with China, who openly discusses our non-role in the Western Pacific, and not with Taiwan, with whom we have, I would submit, a somewhat closer and friendlier relationship, at least the last I checked.
Depends who you talk to.
As I said last I checked. And finally, that does mean also the diplomacy elides into the politics. I have to admit that I can't recall the last specific Taiwan arms sale that went through. The agreement was, I believe, in 2001, but obviously these things take time. I'm not sure when the next arms sale proposal is going to be tabled by the administration. One would hope it would be sooner rather than later, and that they will not see President Obama leaving office without any such proposal at least being put forward. Because while it may or may not specifically tie to the South China Sea, as we've heard from my esteemed colleagues up here, at the end of the day, Taiwan is part of the South China Sea issue, and the South China Sea issue does relate to Taiwan security. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Dean. I wanted to open it up to questions, and maybe to give you guys a little bit of time to think. Start with one. So I wanted to ask Dean and Paul specifically, because you lay out this geopolitical picture, and Dean gets to sort of, both of you get to intentions on the Chinese side, et cetera. So does the big geopolitical value of Taiwan, and then by extension Taiwan's claims in South China Sea, is it of such great geopolitical interest to the PRC that there is no hope, that there is no way of managing this in a way that does not ultimately lead to conflict or leave the PRC in control of the South China Sea?
Deng Xiaoping made very clear that China can be pragmatic. The formulation that he gave is the same that Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping have given. They all open with the same key couplet, which is sovereignty is ours. But as we saw under Deng and also under Jiang, the matter can be one of emphasis, which is to say, is that what one harps on, or is that simply something that is noted? And does it have to stand in the way of other more cooperative efforts? Deng made very clear that he was not going to give up on sovereignty, obviously, but that one could nonetheless cooperate. The issue here is why China should make any concessions on sovereignty, why it should even soft sell the issue of sovereignty when no one holds their feet to the fire. I am not going to change my course of action until there is some reason to do so, whether it is cost imposition, whether it is there are consequences for taking a hard line. But if there are no consequences, why would I change? I mean, one might appeal to the angels of our better nature, but angels are sometimes known for speaking a little too softly.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see how they respond to this arbitral panel resolution, because that's going to put them on the spot. I think I don't think there's very little doubt that the arbitration is going to come out in favor of the Philippines case, at least in some of its essentials, if not entirely. So
If I
that
might
could be a
just
game changer.
I might just respond to that, Walter. I would just point to our own Supreme Court decisions of the last year or two to say that people often expect certain outcomes, but personally, my upbeat, naturally optimistic nature says always wait until they actually issue the final finding.
Well, yeah, I am that, but it's out there. It's sort of the movement, I think, in Beijing. Paul, did you want to address that?
Yes, Walter, there you go again. You frame the issue in terms of China's interests. And there's no question that China has interests here. But I think the question for us is, well, that may be, but what are our interests? And our interests are at least as great as China's, and I would say that they're more fundamental. I mean, we have interests in the free flow of commerce and so on, and those are clear and important interests, frankly, worth fighting for. However, our values are also at risk here. Freedom of the seas is a value as well as an interest. The rule of law and handling problems like this through legal means are important to us. And China, of course, is running roughshod over those values as well as those interests. So this puts us in a very, very difficult position, doesn't it? Because China is betting that we'll just sort of fold our tents and that we won't consider our own interests. And of course, this is the approach that China has taken. It's all about China. It's not all about China. And my perspective is that our interests are at least as compelling as those for China. In fact, I think China's are much more pedestrian and mercenary, actually, in the bigger scheme of things. So this puts us in a very difficult position. I believe that if we don't take very significant action, we're going to have to fight about this or give up. I mean, there are, of course, two alternatives. And I don't think we should give up, and so therefore I think we would have to fight. Now, you may not agree with me, and it could certainly turn out differently. But now consider for a moment, well, what is it that you have to do if you don't want to fight, but you don't want to give up either? Frankly, it's not easy, but then you have to think about what Dean has talked about, which is deterrence in all of his aspects. And the readiness to fight, the willingness to fight, the declaration that you will fight if necessary, and the demonstrated ability to do so. Now, this gets at some things that are particularly important in the context of Taiwan. Under present circumstances, not only can we not look at maps, but we can't talk about this in a Taiwan context, can we? We can't talk about fighting other than, well, you know, we'll do whatever we do. We might do it with Japan, for instance. We can talk about that, I guess. But we certainly can't talk about it with Taiwan because China has taken this off the table. Now, I would tell you that the historical record is quite clear about being able to at least think about things that are either politically unacceptable or literally illegal ahead of time. At least being able to think about them. And what that means is then being able to put in systems and connectivity and organizations and relationships that when the time comes, when the politics change, then we are a step ahead of where we would be otherwise, and perhaps a crucial, vital step ahead. So the specifics of this are in-depth discussions with Taiwan about turnkey systems, about connectivity when the time comes, about doctrines, about plans, organizations, capabilities, mutual support, and so on. The things that we're not allowed to think about because of the politics, and those are imposed strictures, imposed, ironically, by our own system because China says so.
You know, one way to square the circle, I suppose, between these two perspectives is that all that you say, Paul and Dean as well, is necessary backdrop to some constructive outcome. It's not, you know, it's not the legal outcomes like the arbitration alone is not going to do it. There's going to have to be many parts of a formula that create the context for the Chinese eventually finding their pragmatism. Because left to, without American pushback, without the American presence, and as you say, the Americans there in the region looking out for their own interests and pushing back, the Chinese will take their preferred course, which would be to own the whole 800,000 square miles themselves, right? So at least this is creating a backdrop that they necessarily have to contend with.
I agree with that, of course, and just let me add that this is where President Ma's policies come in. What is the thing that we have that China will never have? The moral advantage, right? And so President Ma's approach to this, his peaceful approach, his thoughtful approach, his legalistic approach, is crucial to these outcomes. The problem, of course, is while it's necessary, it's not sufficient. By no means is it sufficient. So I say this in the context of in the context of Taiwan politics. I think it's really important to depoliticize this issue. This is not the issue, the separate issue of Taiwan independence. I'll table that. I think we could talk about that until the cows come home. But this is not about Taiwan independence. This is about Taiwan security. It's different. It's different. And the approach that President Ma has taken, I hope, will transcend and last through to the other side of the coming election. But it's not sufficient.
Great. Are there other questions in the audience? Yeah, thank you. We have a microphone for you.
Iris Shaw.
Yeah, I think it worked. Yeah.
Iris Shaw of DPP U.S. Mission. Dr. Kuo, you mentioned at the end of your presentation that Taiwan's upcoming elections posed uncertain consequences of its South China Sea policy and its broader relationship with China. I assume you mean there's a potential change in power after the election. So with that, I'd like to offer some reassurances. The DPP has been saying for over 2 years that we will adhere to the international law in UNCLOS. As a matter of fact, Dr. Tsai just said it last week at the diplomatic reception. The future DPP government will be committed to following international law UNCLOS in respecting the freedom of navigation. So it's on the record. My question is, you also mentioned about MOFA has a statement in July 7 providing evidence of Taiping Islands that will be human habitant and economic viable. That comes at the time when Philippines brought the case of Ituaba to the hearing of tribunal, stating that it's not an island. So I'd like to know what you think the potential consequences and implications for Taiwan's Taiping Island claim after the court made the decision.
Thanks very much for your question. Let me first address your comment that the DPP has come out to assure everyone that they will be adhering to international law and freedom of navigation. All of this is very encouraging, and I certainly accept that. What I was referencing, in fact, was more the fact that previous members of the members of the DPP's leadership have in the past actually talked about basing Taiwan's claims, if it comes into power, just on features which Taiwan controls. So in other words, mainly Taiping Island. And what this would mean would in effect mean would be that Taiwan might actually be seen to give up its claims to the 4 groups of islands that it currently states to be part of its sovereignty in its official statements. So it wasn't clear. So I think that was what I was alluding to, the fact that there is a potential danger or possibility, given these words from DPP leaders in the past, that Taiwan should just base its claims off features that it controls. So it controls like Taiping Island predominantly. Your second question on Taiping Island, you were saying how will the arbitral tribunal's decision affect Taiwan's
Yes, and because MOFA statement provide evidence, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
I think Taiwan's media has speculated that it has something to do with the pressure of Philippines bringing up the case to the tribunal.
I think that is certainly one concern. I think Taiwan is worried about the implications of the tribunal's decision for its claims over Taiping Island. However, I think the other thing I mentioned in my speech was the fact that it's providing evidence also helps to assure the international community that it is, in fact, seeking to adhere to UNCLOS, because it's only because of UNCLOS that you need to provide evidence that a feature is capable of sustaining human habitation and economic life. Otherwise, there would be no reason, if you wanted to throw UNCLOS to the wind, there would really be no reason why you would need to provide evidence that it is an island under Article 121 of UNCLOS.
Can I just quickly clarify? I'm not sure which DPP leader said the Taiping Island, but Taiping Island has effective control, which is a bipartisan consensus doesn't mean that abiding by the international means potentially we are giving up our sovereignty claim. The last DPP administration has stated, it's all on MOFA's website, that we go by the what's stated in the Constitution.
Good. Thank you for that clarification. Dustin, did you?
Yeah. Allow me to add up certain comments about your question, especially on the second one, the arbitration one. So far as I know, that the Philippine side, they put the legal status of the Taiping Island in their memorial as well as in their in the hearing. They're talking about the legal status of that island. However, their idea is that Taiping Island should not be treated as an island, because an island can claim 200 nautical miles of EEZ. And however, allow me to tell you that the distance between Taiping Island and the biggest island of the Philippines, Palawan, the distance between them is 199.6 nautical miles. So it means that Taiping Island could claim 200 nautical miles, then that will be 200 nautical miles of overlapping with the Philippines claim. Therefore, Philippines, they has to downgrade the legal status of the Taiping Island so that they can move on to let the arbitral tribunal to decide that the Chinese side, their fishermen, they are illegally intrude into their waters. However, I think this would put the arbitration, this kind of issue, into the delimitation, maritime delimitation case, which is not under the mandate of the arbitral tribunal. Thank you.
Yeah, I should point out, I briefly really referenced it, that there's several parts of the arbitration. So it's possible that in every particular, the Philippines will not win.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to, there's issues about continental shelf and features that are on its continental shelf and the 9- map. But I think the sum of it could be just an invalidation of the 9- map as a basis for the claim, even if then each individual parts of that case do not necessarily carry. So I just a point of clarification there, that they could come out in favor of Taiwan basically on that issue, but yet still invalidate the broader significance of the 9- map. Any more questions? I did want to get at least one more in, and we're a little bit over. Please.
Hi, thank you for coming. Not too many people talked about Japan, but what does this all mean to Japan? Japan is a Pacific country that's involved with the Senkaku Island too, so maybe either Paul or Dean can comment on it. Thank you.
Yeah, Paul, that would be good for you.
Thanks for the question. I appreciate it. This is a very interesting turn of events. For the first time since 1945, despite the fact that you could make the case that during the Cold War it was so, Japan considers itself a frontline state. And if you look at the map, you will see that the Ryukyus end about 60 miles from Taiwan. And Japan understands that it is part of this island chain that is a barrier and a shield. It understands that Taiwan is going to play a key military role, but also, again, political. Japan is doing many things sort of under the radar, that is to say, quietly with Taiwan, both militarily and politically. But Japan, I think, has as good a view of the geostrategic and military operational realities involved here as any of the players. Japan is constrained by its constitution, but is now less constrained by the collective self-defense regulations that had been in place and that have now just recently been changed. So I would say if you're interested in this issue of Japan, watch what happens and you'll see. Dean talked about the Chinese admiral in London a few weeks ago. There was a Japanese admiral there too. He's an old friend of mine, and he was speaking up, pushing back, saying, "Listen carefully to my words." And the Japanese have been quite specific about what they'll do, no, let me rephrase that. They've been quite specific about their interests being involved here.
Great. Yeah, please.
Just very quickly, as I noted in my remarks, the Chinese are very good at political warfare. The unfortunate reality is that, as we saw with the 70th anniversary parade in Beijing, this is one of...
Were you there?
No, I was not there.
No.
So, but the issues of the war and of history continue to resonate, continue to influence the region. So within that broader political reality, which has geostrategic consequences, one of the things that I guess I would suggest is that even as Japan is working its way through rethinking issues like collective security, it should also recognize that as the number 3 economy in the world, as one of the foremost powers in the region, it too has non-military options on the table. There is no, if the maritime self-defense forces are gray hulls and perhaps their presence someplace might draw undue attention, there is no reason why Japan cannot dispatch its Coast Guard to cooperate with other countries in the region and to engage in common transnational security cooperation, whether it is over human trafficking, whether it is over drug trafficking, whether it is simply maintaining freedom of navigation and freedom of the seas. That does not only reside in the realm of gray hulls. It can reside in the realm of white hulls.
Thank you.
Without military strength?
White hulls are Coast Guard vessels. They are not military. They are law enforcement.
And that's one thing that Japan has in abundance is Coast Guard vessels, a very, very capable Coast Guard. And a very capable Navy for that matter, but that's what we're not talking about in this case. But can I ask just one final question of Lynn and Dustin, and maybe you can address it in 90 seconds each? One of the most sort of, I think an essential part of any constructive management of this is from the beginning for many years since Deng Xiaoping actually tabled it as, sort of Dean referenced as joint development, and I think it touches on South China Sea Peace Initiative as well. What's to prevent Taiwan private sector from engaging directly with ASEAN private sector to do joint development in the region? You think about different things that can be done that are not government to government. What is to prevent that?
Somebody's phone is...
Don't worry.
That's all right. It's a nice song.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Dustin.
Sure. I think the main difficulty about joint development, I definitely hope to see more joint development take place in the South China Sea. The main difficulty in my mind about joint development is where it should be taking place. So, I think parties need to also get together to actually ascertain the areas over which joint development can unproblematically take place. And I think one way of determining this would be to say that to jointly, like all ASEAN countries plus China and Taiwan, preferably, should get together and identify the features in the South China Sea which could potentially be an island under UNCLOS. So take that and then draw 200 nautical miles EEZ around it, and then say, you know what, this is kind of the area over which we can agree to disagree. And this is the area over which private companies can, without too much trouble, jointly develop. But you need that political consensus first, because I think private investors are not going to be investing in joint development if there's a potentially political problem at the end of the day. So that's...
Yeah. very quickly response. I believe that joint development should be started with the certain items which is linked to the ecological issues. For example, hydrocarbon resources, that is the most attractive one. However, people would always say that 1 barrel I extract from that oil well, then you would lost one. So that is a zero-sum gain. However, if we can put more attention on the living resources and then or to protect the environmental protection issues, then I think that would be much more sensible and logic. And but it seems to me that a couple of days ago that we can read it from the newspaper that NASA has already found out the flowing water on Mars. And it seems to me that it is much difficult to find out a solution in the South China Sea. However, I think joint development could be the best way to do that. Thank you.
I think the Chinese have claimed that water on Mars is an inalienable part of China's territory since ancient times, in fact. With that, please join me in thanking our panelists for today's excellent discussion.